Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're going to discuss this topic of Western armor versus Eastern armor. We will divide this video into two sections. But before this, I'd like to say, why did I choose to talk about this concept? Because the very basic of West versus East is what gave birth to the concept of knights versus samurai and the concept of katana versus longsword. All of this comes from the very basic essence of a concept of West versus East. So as I said, this video will be structured in two sections. In the first section, we will try to understand what does West and what does East mean within this very concept and what it should mean, which are two different things. And secondly, in the second part, we will start talking a little bit about the reasons why Western people chose to dress their soldiers in a way and Eastern people chose to dress their soldiers in their way. Okay, so section number one is what do we mean by West and what do we mean by East? When generally speaking, or roughly speaking, most people, when they think of a Western warrior, they come up with the idea of the medieval knight. Whereas most people, when they think of the idea of an Eastern warrior, they come up with the idea of the Japanese samurai. But this is incredibly reductive. And this actually bothers me a little bit. And I have to say that I myself, on my channel, I have mostly focused on Japanese warfare, and then I have mostly focused on medieval warfare and, of course, Roman. Because again, although when we think of Western warriors, we think of the knight, well, Roman soldiers were definitely Western warriors, just as much as Greek warriors were Western warriors, of course. But then we're going into antiquity, we're going to classical times. But you see, the reason why on my channel, up to now, I have mostly focused on samurai when talking about the Far East is because I have a university degree in Japanese language and culture, and I have lived in Japan. So it's not that I'm fanboying over Japan, it's that that's the area that I have academical training in. But when we think or when we talk about Eastern warriors, and if we really want to be thorough when we compare the Western world and the Eastern world, then we should be thinking and we should be talking about Chinese warriors. We should be talking about the sort of armors and weapons that they used. We should be talking about Thai warriors and the sort of weapons and armor that they used, and so forth. And this is something that I am planning on introducing into my channel soon. I would like to focus a little bit on Thai history. I have already made a few videos on Chinese history, and I have a video where I basically talk about all Chinese dynasties. But before people actually correct me here, because I have been corrected, of course, by people in the comments, dynasty is the official British pronunciation of that word. Dynasty is also a possible pronunciation, but it's more American English. This is why I say dynasty. I find nothing wrong with dynasty. If you want to pronounce it dynasty, you pronounce it dynasty. If you want to pronounce it dynasty, please feel free to pronounce it dynasty, but don't come and tell me that I'm saying it wrong, because it's dynasty in England. And I'm actually mostly speaking to Italians now, because most of the people who actually corrected me, telling me, well, you don't even know it's pronounced dynasty, are Italians, okay? Because natives know that both pronunciations are acceptable. It's just like saying vitamin in England and vitamin in America. Different accents. So I will be talking about these things on my channel, but of course, in order to do that, I needed to get some proper documentation, and I am working on some proper research. So as I said, I already have some videos on Chinese history, because I did study Chinese history at university, but I did not study Thai history at university. I'm just saying Thai as an example. We could talk about the Philippines, we could talk about Indian warfare. There are lots of different things that we could talk about, and I don't want my channel to be restricted only to Japan and Western Europe. Because again, when we say Western world, we often focus on Western Europe, but there is also Eastern Europe. And I know that quite a few people have been asking me to talk about the Hussars, or Hussars. I have no idea how to pronounce that one, so please correct me in this case, because I don't know. But yeah, I will make videos about that as well. Because we could talk about Romanian warriors, we could talk about Turkish warriors. There are so many things that could be talked about. And again, when we focus on Western history, for example, and Western European history, and we look at arms and armor worn and used, or used and worn by the Europeans. English armor is different, German armor is different, Italian armor is different, and that's even more so in the east, because Japan was separated. The Japanese mostly fought against other Japanese. A brief exception against the Mongols, but it was too brief in order to really radically change the way they would approach warfare. But if you look at the Chinese, for example, Chinese armor and weapons are very different from that of the Japanese. So that will be a very interesting chapter to open. And again, Thai weapons and armors, and again, Korean weapons and armors. Koreans have had amazing warriors as well. And it's nice for me, I think, to be able to open these new chapters on my channel, particularly now that I have daily upload, which allows me to cover a lot more fields in terms of video making. So expect that to be happening on the channel. So this was the first part of this video that I wanted to clarify. Today's video is not going to be particularly long because today was a very, very, very tough day at work. In fact, now it's already evening, and if I make too much of a well-structured video, similarly to my recent video on Roman colors, which took 5 hours of research just to prepare, and then it took a few other hours to film, and then 6 hours to edit, you know, I can't do this today. So when I can, I will. When I can't, I can't. But today I want to tell you this. So the first part of the video is this. We need to widen our understanding. We need to start including these other cultures in the picture, and that's something I want to do because I find these countries and their past to be equally interesting to the mainstream ones. Now, for the second part of this video, I would like to discuss the reasons why these populations have or had a different and such a different approach to arming and protecting their warriors. Well, there are a lot of aspects that need to be taken into consideration. For example, financial aspect. That's the very first thing. Economical situation. How much could such state or such country or such empire or such kingdom invest in the production of high quality equipment for his soldiers? Although most of these weapons and armors look very ancient and old to us, for those people at the time, they were the top-notch level of technology or warfare technology at the time. Hence, these things would have been rather expensive. When we imagine a full-plate armored knight, his armor would be equivalent, for a person who wants to buy that, would be equivalent to purchasing a sports car now. So these things were incredibly expensive because they were the best available form of warfare technology. So economical situation. Secondly, the warfare or battle environment. In what areas are these populations fighting? Are they fighting in woods? Are they fighting in grassland? Are they fighting in wasteland, in the desert? Are they fighting on rivers? Are they fighting on boats? Are they mostly having sieges? Are they mostly fighting open field warfare, like, for example, the Romans? All of these factors will shape the equipment used by these soldiers accordingly. And something like this we see, for example, with the Romans. You know that most of the times when we see, for example, the Trajan column, we see that most of the times Romans don't have much protection for their arms. And yet, during the Dacian Wars, the Romans will use the full manica for the right arm. And that was a reaction to the sort of weapons that the enemy was using, which were particularly effective at reaching the arm while the Romans were striking. So again, whenever a population encounters a problem, a new solution needs to be taken. And this is why a game like For Honor, although it's very, very interesting, and it's fantasy, of course, so this is not really a complaint, but I'm saying that probably the most fantasy aspect of that game is the fact that over 1,000 years of knights, samurai and Vikings fighting each other, there has been no significant change in their equipment. And this is something that would never have happened in the real world. So by this, what I'm trying to say is that my personal thesis is that if the Japanese ever really met the Western European knights in combat over a certain amount of time, so I'm talking perhaps a couple of centuries, or even 100 years really would be enough for that, there would have been significant changes in the equipment of both the samurai and the knights accordingly. Now, having an hypothetical discussion or speculating on what these changes could have been could be an interesting topic for a future video, but of course it would be speculative history in order to create fun food for thought. So, economical, the land or the battlegrounds that they're using, and the enemy they are facing. So these are the first 3 points that help us understand why a certain country chooses. It's not just a matter of the Japanese invented this, and this is the Japanese style, and the European invented this, and this is the European style. No, it's not just a matter of preference. Sometimes it is. As a matter of fact, the European chose to have a certain level of protection for their arms. The Japanese chose a lighter version of protection for their arms. But of course, this is also, it's not just preference in terms of I want more mobility rather than protection, which is always a compromise. Armor is always a compromise between mobility and protection. But in the case of samurai, we do need to understand the roots of the very concept of a warrior such as the samurai, who was initially an archer. So if you're an archer, you need to be able to extend your arms fully, and operating a bow with that sort of knight's full plate armor would be rather problematic. Although, regardless of the fact that you can move freely in knight's armor, using a bow or operating a bow would be a completely different situation. So in that case, we see again that there is a fourth situation. What are these units supposed to do? Because often I notice that when people compare again the famous one, knight against samurai, they're like, yeah, the samurai are quick and the knights are slow. Apart from the fact that this is not true, and I actually have a video on this, knights versus samurai, where I do discuss in detail these things. If you want, I'll just leave a link at the end of this video. Because they always imagine the knight with a long sword and the samurai with a katana, but the samurai is an archer. And then he will move to polearms. The knight uses shock cavalry, and then he moves for hand-to-hand combat. If he's fighting against an armored opponent, he will use maces, blunt weapons, and such. And even some certain kinds of polearm. Point that I would like to bring up for today's video is the availability of resources that a certain country has. And we do know that this has influenced, for example, Japanese production of weapons and armor, because they didn't have the same kind of iron, the same kind of ore, and the same amounts that the Europeans had. Consequently, this led to certain decisions. What would the Japanese have done if they had access to 3 times the amount of metal that they did? Difficult to say, but I definitely think that we would see again a different evolution of their weapons and armor, and who knows, perhaps even battle tactics. What the Japanese chose was effective against their own countrymen. It was effective within the context of fighting always in Japan. What Western European did was effective in their own situations and so forth. And I would imagine, and I will deepen my understanding on these topics, so I would imagine that the same concept will apply in Thai military history, in Chinese military history, and in whatever military history, even if we manage to have a first contact with the Martians, okay? I don't know, a population that was in Mars before, and we find some proof and we find some historical records of their battles and their wars. I think that still very similar universal concept will remain. We all wanted to win, and we all wanted to gain as much advantage over our opponent as possible. Okay, well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Today we had a little bit of a informal conversation, but I'd like to know which country would you like me to address first? Would you like me to talk about Thai armor and weapons, or Korean, for example, or do you want me to talk about the Philippines? Do you want me to talk about Romania? Do you want me to talk about Turkey? Which one would you like me to talk about? Perhaps even African weapon and armor? Please let me know in the comments below. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye, noble ones.